Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade and the world of Heredor. Your perfectly safe and sound place to keep the single most important person in the entirety of the Imperial Crusade. More important even than War Master Makaroth. For whilst a War Master can be replaced, a Saint cannot. And yet still, Saint Sabbat, now undoubtedly proven to be a living saint, is protected by nothing more than a handful of warships, 12,000 militia, and a single regiment of light infantry. Small wonder that Chaos thinks it's been given a gift-wrapped opportunity to end the war immediately. And that is just what they're thinking of doing. Imperial reinforcements are hurrying through the warp to Heredor even as we speak. A major flotilla including carriers, capital ships, and several more regiments of heavy Imperial Guard troops, along with additional fortifications and improvements to the Civitas Beate. There is a brief window of opportunity to strike now. But it's not quite that simple either. Whilst Chaos is aware of the incredible importance of Heredor right now, it is not an undefended world. The forces upon its surface may be somewhat lackluster, but in orbit sits the battleship Omnia Vincent, along with the frigates Navarre, Berengaria, and the Glory of Cadia, and the heavy cruiser Laudate Divinitas. By no means an insignificant force. Indeed, it should prove quite the challenge to any would-be raider. The greatest issue the fleet is currently dealing with is the hundreds of pilgrim vessels that are interfering with the warship's ability to properly picket the planet. Not to mention wasting a tremendous amount of their time stopping, searching, scanning, and constantly updating and aiding the vessels themselves, as the merchant ships arrive with little preamble and could be carrying pretty much anything. A good deal of them are barely void-worthy and constantly drift out of their assigned orbital positions. Not to mention a whole host of other problems, be it supplies, repair, mechanical failure, or as is happening right now, the transport Troubadour, reporting a fire raging across its decks. It requests assistance from the Imperial Navy, and the Navarre moves to offer it. Poor timing, as Fleet Captain Esquine aboard the Omnia Vincent was just about to give the Navarre the order to move up to the closest warp convergence point to Heredor. Instead, the fleet captain chose the frigate Berengaria to move up instead, its fighter screen deployed and its weapons active. There had been another group of ships detected on the way towards Heredor, you see, although very little of their actual nature, purpose, or, well, anything, frankly, could be gleaned, due to the massive warp overload that had been caused by so many ships coming and going to Heredor. It was expected to be simply yet more pilgrim ships, but the fleet captain had been ordered to exercise maximum caution by the War Master himself, and he intended to follow those orders. In the fleet captain's word, the Berengaria could either welcome incoming friendlies or repel incoming hostiles. Incidentally, as an aside, there is also some documented confusion as to the nature of the Berengaria herself. The fleet captain referred to her as a frigate. The Berengaria herself would probably have preferred to have been referred to as a light cruiser. But I suppose anything smaller than a grand cruiser is all the same to a captain of a battleship. Regardless, as the Berengaria moved towards the convergence point, things took a turn for the mysterious in the rearward lines. The Navarre, having moved to assist the transport Troubadour, had attached its boarding ramps firmly to the ship, and were ready to begin transferring its firefighting teams over to the Troubadour when the source of their entire maneuvering and docking, the fire, seemingly disappeared. The heat readings that the Troubadour had been detecting flickered out and vanished. This is unusual. As we have learned, unusual things tend to be very, very bad things in the 41st millennium, with at least one recent exception, so there's that. However, the crew aboard the Navarre were not particularly confident that this was going to be one of those good things. Initially, the Navarre had elected to not stand 2 armsmen alongside the docking clamps, 9 in total connecting it to the Troubadour. Now, however, one group of armsmen were brought up to investigate the strange occurrences. This group of armsmen went into the Troubadour and were never heard from again, unless you count the sudden overloading burst of static that emerged from the Vauxhorn on the ship's bridge, as a grenade detonated in the middle of the group of armsmen. The order was of course immediately given to sever all 9 of the docking clamps, but they were no longer responding to the remote controls from the Navarre's bridge, which could only mean that boarding parties had already raced across those very selfsame docking connections and disabled the override on the other side. The Navarre was about to have a very bad day, as the order was given for all armsmen to stand to and begin repelling boarders. Luckily, at least the Navarre's misfortune appeared to be it and its alone, as the warp disturbance that had been heralding the arrival of more ships broke open and deposited Imperial ships into real space, including another Imperial Navy frigate to join Fleet Captain Esquine's formation. The warp convergence, however, did not close. This was not unexpected, as the size of the disturbance indicated something along the lines of a dozen or more vessels, and yet only 8 had actually arrived. Still, if the first wave was Imperial, the odds were pretty damn overwhelmingly good that the next waves would be Imperials as well. That this was simply just a strung-out convoy of allied ships. Feeling relieved, Fleet Captain Esquine then sent messages to the Navarre, inquiring as to whether or not it required any assistance to defeat the boarders that had apparently arrived from the Troubadour. This was unusual, of course, but, well, there had already been significant uprisings on the planet down below, from heretics insurgents that had infiltrated alongside the various pilgrims and their pilgrim vessels, of course. It stood to reason, therefore, that other insurgents had remained hidden aboard their ships, and this group had apparently managed to seize control of the Troubadour and launched some sort of a desperate gambit, an ambush, in an effort to seize command of the Navarre, to blow up a warship. Who knows? Aboard the Navarre, Captain Bismarck received the offer for aid and declined it. It was his estimate that the Navarre's armsmen could repel these boarders and push them back into the Troubadour. Once this was achieved, they would of course enter in the manual override codes to blow the docking clamps, and then the Navarre would destroy the Troubadour. Simple enough. First, of course, the docking clamps had to actually be reached, but whilst the action was growing quite heavy, it appeared to be well within the capabilities of the Navarre's armsmen to deal with. No need to divert further already overstretched Imperial resources to hasten the matter. Unfortunately, and beyond Captain Bismarck's understanding at that point in time, things were about to get a lot more complicated. The Troubadour was not intending or hoping to overwhelm the Navarre with merely heretic insurgents. No, they were using significantly more esoteric methods as well. Some sort of mind control spell. Those who encountered it reported a loud buzzing that seemed to settle in between their ears somewhere, after which many of the Navarre's armsmen and crew were lost to chaotic influence. Simultaneously as this was happening as well, the next wave of ships were coming through the warp disturbance, but they were not Imperials this time. A Chaos fleet had quite clearly, and very cleverly as well, managed to coast in behind onto the wake of an incoming Imperial force to hide itself from the searching augurs of the Imperial defenders. Now, under normal, more ideal circumstances, this could probably have been detected, either by the first incoming Imperial fleet or by the fleet already in station above Heredor. But again, with all the warp disturbances, it went largely unnoticed, allowing 4 Chaos warships to breach the thin veil of reality and coast in at full attack speed towards the Imperial defenders. Of course, Fleet Captain Esquine had not been caught completely unaware. He had already routed a frigate up to the convergence point to make sure that they could escort in allies or meet enemies, along with a fighter screen to provide support. But the scale of the enemy attack would not be so easily repelled by a single frigate, as early augur estimates suggested 4 warships, 3 cruisers, and 1 enormous capital ship. As the fleet began the procedure of attempting to identify exactly what vessels they were up against, Fleet Captain Esquine immediately gave the orders for everyone to man battle stations and prepare to repel the raiders. The first step, of course, was identification and organization. Requests went out yet again to see if the Navarre was done with its invasion problem. It was not. Its armsmen were still fighting against the boarders from the Troubadour. They would not be available for some time yet. The other vessels, however, all reported that they were ready to advance, and the preliminary identification of the enemy vessels was also beginning to stream in. 2 of the cruisers had been positively identified as the Cicatrice and the Revenant. The 3rd cruiser was identified as either the Suture or more likely the Harm's Way, and the 4th and by far largest vessel was classified as a battleship and assigned the provisional identification as the Incardine. That meant that the poor Berengaria found itself in the path of 3 cruisers and a battleship. An unenviable position for a frigate to be in. The first of the enemy warships, the Revenant, coasted by the Berengaria at maximum speed, all energy rerouted to its engines as it shot past, pursuing the Imperial convoy that had emerged before the Chaos Raiders not 20 minutes ago. As the Revenant passed, the Berengaria, of course, attempted to engage with its flank lance batteries, but at that speed it only really got off 1 volley, and it was nowhere near enough to inflict serious telling damage upon the speeding cruiser. And that would be pretty much the Berengaria's sole singular contribution to the battle, as she now found herself being pummeled by the lancers and guns of the 2 remaining cruisers and the Incardine. The Berengaria stood bravely and did not retreat even until the very end, when a barrage of torpedoes from the Harm's Way struck her amidship from the flank, even as the Incardine's lance batteries finally overwhelmed her shields and gutted the warship from stem to stern. Not a great start for the Imperials, and it was only going to get worse, as the Revenant, still out of effective weapons range of the rest of the Imperial fleet, now entered firing distance towards the Imperial convoy. blowing two of the huge and lumbering mass conveyance transports into pieces, even as Fleet Captain Esquine gave the order for the Imperial battle line to advance, in an attempt to shield the rest of the convoy and also to protect the ships already in anchor above Heredor. Although one civilian vessel, the Somnambulist, was to take its main source of damage from the Omnia Vincent rather than the enemy Chaos ships, as the Vincent fired a single lance weapon at the Somnambulus, destroying its engines. It had been trying to break for high anchor and move to what it perceived, presumably, to be safety, but with the civilian transport's engines, any safety it could head towards would have been illusionary at best. And if all of the various civilian ships started moving about, that would only complicate the situation for the Imperial defenders. And so a quick example was made from the Somnambulus of what would happen to any other ships that decided to break anchor without express permission. Yet another urging was also issued to the Navarre to finish her boarding action and rejoin the rest of the fleet. Aboard the Navarre, Captain Bismarck apparently agreed. He issued the emergency override procedure on the docking clamps, blowing both the clamps and significant portions of the hull in total off the Navarre, before issuing the order to target the Troubadour and destroy it. All well and good. It had caused some damage to the Navarre and had cost about 100 armsmen their lives, as they were given no opportunity to evacuate the areas that would necessarily be vented into space. But at least now the frigate was at long last free and could start heading towards the rest of the Imperial battle line. Or so it was assumed by the Navarre's crew, as Captain Bismarck ordered another firing solution to be created. Again, weird things are usually bad things in the 41st millennium, as of course there were no enemy warships anywhere near the effective firing envelope of the Navarre. Her sister frigate, the Solstice, however, was. And that was the very target that Captain Bismarck was designating. There were objections, of course, but Captain Bismarck silenced them with fists and service weapon. And soon thereafter, the Navarre's weapons cut through the Solstice, creating the second Imperial casualty of the fight, as the Chaos brain control that had been seeping its way into the vessel from its connection with the now destroyed Troubadour had done its work. Fleet Captain Esquine's force was down 3 frigates, and he'd barely fired a shot in anger at the invading Chaos warships. This was turning out to be an exceptionally shit day to be in the Imperial Navy. Scrambling now to get a grip on the situation, Fleet Captain Esquine ordered his heavy cruiser, the Laudate Divinitatis, to strike towards Heredor, where it would engage and destroy the Chaos cruiser, the Revenant, which was currently preoccupied with slaughtering helpless pilgrim vessels in orbit. By diverting his only other sizable warship, Fleet Captain Esquine was taking a big gamble here. The hope was that the Laudate Divinitas could destroy the Revenant quickly, and then rejoin the battle line, as the Omnia Vincent would find herself severely outgunned in the face of the other 2 Chaos cruisers and battleship, with only frigates to support her. However, the captain's hopes would not come to fruition, as the Laudate Divinitatis severely underestimated her smaller but far more ferocious opponent. Despite initially taking a stinging barrage from the Laudate Divinitatis, the Revenant swung around quickly, responding with its own weaponry and outmaneuvering the heavy cruiser. A lucky hit from the smaller Revenant's weapon batteries opening up a gap in the Laudate Divinitatis shields, a gap that the Revenant was swift to exploit. Pouring all of its firepower into this newfound weakness, the Laudate Divinitatis began to shudder and explode as countless internal detonations tore the vessel apart, leaving the Revenant safe to settle into high orbit above Heredor and begin the deployment of its landing parties. Simultaneously, the main Imperial fleet force encountered the incoming Chaos main force. The engagement started out favorably for the Imperium, as the glory of Cadia struck well above its weight class, crippling the cruiser Cicatrice. The doughty little frigate had moved in close to punish the far heavier ship, but this left her exposed as well. Even as fires raged through the Cicatrice's decks, she used the last vestiges of her forward momentum and energy to propel herself straight in to the glory of Cadia, destroying both vessels in the collision. Quickly stripped of her escorts, the Omnia Vincent now found herself alone, mercilessly bombarded by the remaining Chaos cruiser, the Harm's Way, and the battleship Incardine. The Omnia Vincent responded as well as she could, but again luck was not on the Imperium's side. A torpedo from the Harm's Way managed to slip past the Omnia Vincent's intercept network. Boring slowly through her shields, it struck right beneath the battleship's bridge, injuring or outright killing the majority of her command and control crew, leaving the captain, Esquine, completely crippled and mortally wounded. Severed from his mind impulse link, he could do nothing to command the enormous vessel. Desperate efforts were undertaken by other officers to try and keep the ship in the fight, whilst emergency repairs were carried out that might allow her to return to the offensive. But before any such valiant efforts could be concluded, a group of Locust fighters made it into the Omnia Vincent hangars. One was destroyed immediately by point defenses. Another one, rather impotently, unloaded its payload into the hangars, causing some damage but nothing severe. The third Locust, however, gunning its engines to the max on a suicide run, managed to reach one of the Omnia Vincent's munitions elevator and dumped its entire weapons payload straight down into it, causing a mass chain reaction that blew out the entire ship's flank. Laying now dead in the void, without engines and without shields, the Omnia Vincent was merely a vast hunk of scrap metal, as the Chaos warships moved in close and executed the venerable Imperial ship with point-blank land salvos, before the Harm's Way and Incardine settled in next to the Revenant and began deploying their own invasion forces. Down on the planet, not particularly shockingly, everything was panic. The handful of communications that had been received from the fleet in orbit initially suggested that the Imperial Navy elements had a decent chance of repelling or outright destroying the attackers. But as time wore on, the news became significantly less optimistic. From the scattered reports, it appeared as if only a single one of the invading vessels had been destroyed, and the Imperial fleet had been all but eradicated. There were also reports of strange vessels in amongst the Chaos forces, one apparently claiming to have positively identified a Dark Eldar fighter from the reports of the countless tiny ships, the fighters and the bombers, that had been swirling around in the fight whilst their mother vessels fought. The defenders were of course completely unaware of this as of yet, but the Chaos invasion force was, by and large, frankly, a distraction from the real thrust of the matter. 9 assassins, hand-picked by the Magister himself, would go down to the surface of the planet and execute the Imperial Saint. Innokenti was not taking any chances here, and even as the Imperial ground commanders feared that this navy would simply stand off in orbit and bombard the Civitas Beati, which it most assuredly could have done, the Civitas Beati did not have the shields or the orbital defenses to deny them. The worry was dispelled as mass landing operations were undertaken by the Chaos Fleet. A small comfort, as there still appeared to be more than enough Chaos forces to overwhelm the Civitas Beati many times over, but at the very least this death was less certain than the one that could have been delivered from orbit, but certainty was also the very reason why it would not be delivered from the sky. Innokenti knew that an orbital bombardment, no matter how heavy, no matter how methodical, no matter how overwhelming, could not guarantee the Saints' death. And even if it was all but certain, the simple lack of absolute proof would give the Imperials all the hope they needed to continue to believe in their saint. Only a body, only a confirmed kill would be good enough. And if a few tens of thousands of servants needed to be sacrificed for that body to be delivered at Innokenti's feet, then that was a price he was more than willing to pay. How much, however, was still up to the defenders for the moment. The Civitas Beati had, while not really expected to be the focus of anything of this scale, but like all good Imperial military districts, it had taken some precautions to ready itself in the case of enemy action, and particularly considering this was a world in the Sabbat worlds, it had prepared itself to be invaded by the Archenemy. The plan that was chosen today was GAR-3, Ground Assault Response Number 3. The plan was as simple as it was unavoidable in this set of circumstances. The Civitas militia and the planetary defense forces would gather up alongside the life company of General Lugo and the ghosts in the center of the Civitas Beati. There they would remain, staged and as fully mounted as they could be, alongside their supporting armor, and they would move to respond to whatever attack the Chaos forces mounted against them. It was the obvious move, forced as much upon the defenders as it was chosen, as they were now severely outnumbered and assaulted from orbit, meaning that the attackers could land their troops, well, wherever they damn well pleased. Attempting to throw up any sort of defensive cordon around the city, or to rely on fixed positions, would be extremely foolish. As if the Imperials elected to mass in the south, well, the Chaos invaders could simply dump all of their troops in the north, and vice versa, and so on. And unfortunately, it appeared as if the enemy understood this advantage as well. The initial Chaos landings were formed of a group of about 8,000 infantry and 300 light vehicles, mostly stock tanks, AT-70 stegs, and a handful of AT-83 heavier vehicles. This would merely be the spearhead advance pushing into the Civitas Beati, and they would spread out across the northwest, northeast, and southern approaches to the Civitas, forcing the Imperials immediately to spread out to meet multiple advances. Now, for the moment at least, they would possess a numerical advantage in infantry. They're now 17-odd thousand, with the addition of all of the city's Arbites troops also levied into military service, but they were already outnumbered close to 2-to-1 in armor, and a lot of that armor was, well, trucks. Light vehicles, unarmed with anything more than possibly a stub gun at best. The only semi-decent armor the defenders possessed were mostly located within General Lugo's Lifeguard Company, including a group of Vanquisher Leman Russ main battle tanks. Their long-barreled anti-tank guns would prove very, very useful and in high demand during the initial skirmishes. They were also luxuriously equipped with specialized armor-piercing shells, which should, in theory, give them the edge against anything the Chaos Forces were capable of deploying. In theory, that is, at least. But the defenders did have one advantage, and that was intimate knowledge of the Civitas Beati itself. You see, Ground Assault Response Number 3 was not merely just the general outlay of a strategy to deny an invasion, it also came with detailed notes and annotations across the city's layout, pointing out areas where ambushes might be carried out, pointing out covered paths of travel where troops could move without fear of being attacked from above, as dive bombers were already beginning to rain down upon the Civitas Beati from the Chaos fleet in orbit. The planet also laid out a detailed study of where troops could strike and then fall back to strike again, creating multiple overlapping layers of ambush zones, where the enemy could be dragged in only to be hit hard by yet further troops laying in wait, even as the first ambushing group would bypass the defenders to rearm and resupply, then to stand by ready to repel yet further invaders as the next group withdraw to do the same. All credit must be extended to Biagi of the Civitas Beati Defense Force here, as he had clearly wargamed out a tremendous amount of scenarios for the defense of his beloved home city. Were it not for his detailed instructions and meticulous planning, the defenders might very well have found themselves at a severe disadvantage almost as soon as the first shot was being fired. Instead, it was the Chaos scouting forces that would get their nose bloodied. The Tanith would be deployed in the northeast in the Masonry area, where some of the heaviest fighting was expected. The Blood Pact came on practically in parade formation, singing as they came, and taking the time to destroy various items of religious significance on the way, blowing up bell towers or destroying aqueducts. Granted, the latter would eventually deny the city access to clean water in, a few months, when whatever stores they had ran out, but it was sort of a strategic objective. Sort of. At least significantly more so than the bell towers. But the mirthful advance did not last very long, as the Blood Pact quickly realized that they were in for some pretty serious resistance. The Tanith, of course, excelled at this kind of warfare, where they were able to strike quickly and effectively. Their beloved tread feathers being more than enough to deal with AT-70s, stalk tanks, and occasionally the AT-83 brigands as well. Granted, those would usually need to be engaged either with tube charges to blow up their tracks or via outflanking positions, as shooting them in the flanks or the rear, or better yet the top, would be ideal. Luckily, the Civitas Beati was, as the name of course implies, a heavily built-up urban area, offering ample opportunity both for outflanking and out-elevating the enemy. Thus, the initial Blood Pact advance early in the day was quickly stymied with heavy casualties, and no real gains to speak of. The Blood Pact were not amateurs at this either, however, and began around noon to pull back their advanced forces, realizing that advancing on a wide front, although theoretically wise to overwhelm what they presumed to be a numerically inferior defender, which incidentally was not the case as of yet at least, Well, the strategy had proven somewhat disastrous, and so now they refocused. Instead of attempting to spread out and overwhelm the enemy's ability to defend themselves, instead the Blood Pact would mass their armor into one thrust down the main transit arteries of the Civitas Beati, after which they could then, after having secured the transitway, begin spreading out from the transitway and into the city, thus, in theory, avoiding a great deal of the more obvious ambush areas. That would require, however, for them to first smash through the main transit artery, which was in and of itself an obvious strategic feature for the defenders to hold on to. Having therefore expected this obvious change of tactic from the invader, the Life Company tanks, their treasured vanquishers, were located right here, ready to take advantage of an infantry ambush to sally forth and destroy the lead enemy armor. Several AT-70 Stegs and even AT-83s were quickly destroyed. But the previous assumption that the Life Company vanquishers would be enough to deal with anything the enemy was going to throw at them was quickly and brutally proven incorrect, as one of their number was not merely destroyed, but blown to smithereens as its hull was impacted upon by an enormous main battery shell, as a blood-packed, super-heavy Baneblade tank began rolling down the highway, firing as it came. It turns out that the archenemy had been playing tricks of their very own, realizing that the Imperial defenders had spread out in order to stimulate them across a wide front, and that they were unlikely to break through quickly. The Blood Pact commanders had instead decided to up the ante and force a decision, and they would do so via 3 measures. The first was listening into Imperial communications, which had been broken within hours of the Chaos Force's arrival, as their own tactical logistical units had figured out their entire dataset, and were now allowing their ground force commanders to listen in to Imperial communication. Obviously, the Imperials, suspecting that this might happen, either through technological or psychic means, were communicating only using code words to refer to commanders and locations throughout the city, which the Imperials would then cross-reference with Ground Assault Response 3 to figure out exactly what all of this meant. This would still, however, give the invaders a serious advantage, as they would quickly be able to get a good estimate and a picture of where the defenders were located. The second part of the plan was to blanket cut off all Imperial communications. Having gleaned all they figured they needed to from the Imperial Vox network, the next step was to employ psychers to broadcast broadband interference, shutting down all communication, both Blood Pact and Imperial. But the Blood Pact could of course communicate via warp means, whereas the Imperials were completely unable to do so over anything more than very short distances. And the third part of the plan was to, right before the jamming set in, present the Imperials with an obvious target: the large advance down the main arterials of the city, expected to be met by the enemy's premier anti-tank vehicles, the greatest threat to the enormous masses of Chaos forces still marshalling out in the Obsidian Wastes. And the Imperials had fallen for the bait, and had lost quite a number of their own vanquishers, their premier in both efficiency and maneuverability anti-tank platforms, in the face of a Baneblade. The Baneblade might very well have been able to lead a spearhead thrust straight down the throat of the Civitas Beati thereafter, were it not for the intervention of the Saint. For the only thing more powerful than a Baneblade is a walking nuclear weapon, which is pretty much what a Saint is upon contact with the enemy. Armed with nothing more than a sword and a pistol, she cut the Baneblade apart, tearing open its hatches, killing its crew, and dumping crack grenades down through the hatches, destroying the Baneblade in mere seconds. And even more impressive than her ability to swing a sword through a tank barrel is the effect that she had upon the Imperial defenders. Gathering up what platoons she came across as she moved, she led a counter-assault that sent the Blood Pact reeling back out of the Masonry district. Not merely re-establishing Imperial defense lines as they were about to begin to falter, but throwing the Blood Pact out to the point where the Imperials could actually advance in the Saints' wake and re-establish even deeper defenses. It was not to be all good news this day, however, for whilst the majority of the defenses had held very well, in the west things were beginning to crack. After having offered effective and very stubborn resistance through the entirety of the day, panic set in just after midnight, when Vibison, the commander in the glasswork sections in the west, was killed by what had first appeared to be a lucky shot, blowing his brains out all over his second-in-command. Vibison had been the primary reason why the western defences had held as well as they had. On no less than 3 separate occasions, they had almost collapsed completely, with Blood Pact penetrations of the Western District. Each and every time it was Vibison who had led a countercharge to reseal the defences and hunt down and destroy the Blood Pact who had slipped through the net. With him dead, and that fact now being broadcast loudly across the communications networks whom, ironically enough, the Imperials had just managed to start freeing up to their immediate cost by destroying the enemy's interference vehicles, well, now the news of Vibison's death spread like wildfire through the defenders, causing multiple major breakthroughs in the western sectors. And the man responsible for those breakthroughs, a Blood Pact sniper by the name of Saul, who had been tasked along with 8 others to hunt down the Saint, simply followed the destructive wake of the Blood Pact as he moved deeper into the city in search of his quarry. And Saul was far from the only one of the Archenemy's assassins to cause some serious problems for the defenders. The Tanith's first and only had managed to maintain a very solid front line that nothing seemed to be able to slip through until 3 other assassins, a pack of Loxotal siblings, cut through the defenders, near mortally wounding Commissar Hark in the process by tearing off one of his arms. Hark did manage to make this an expensive endeavour for the Loxotals though, as even though their amphibious scaly hides were near impervious to lasfire, that did not stop Hark's bolt pistol from finding purchase within one of them, killing the first of the assassins. On a wider level then, the first day had worked out relatively well for the Imperial defenders, everything considered. The mess in the glassworks was a major concern, and reserve reinforcements would need to be thrown in to try and stymie the Blood Pact advance there the next day. But even so, having been in possession of virtually no artillery heavier than mortars or light short snub-barreled artillery pieces, the defenders had managed to hold out well against the enemy's infantry advances. Equally so, despite not having much in the way of anti-tank weaponry, besides a handful of vanquishers and shoulder-mounted tube launchers, the enemy's armor had not managed to gain solid purchase in the city either. And despite the enemy's absolute superiority in the air, the defenders' ability to stick close to the invader had prevented the dive bombers and the locusts from doing too much damage, as they ran too large of a risk of striking their own troops in the close confines of the Civitas Beati. Now, it must also then be hurriedly pointed out that the reasons why the Imperials had done so well were twofold. One, the counterattack led by the Saint Sabbat destroying the enemy super heavy, and thus retreating the situation that was looking grim indeed in the Masonry district. And two, the simple fact that Chaos had not attacked with all their forces. Indeed, their efforts so far could be described as nothing more than a reconnaissance in force, a simple probe to determine the strength of the defenders and their positions. As even early on in the day, the general estimate was that there was over 500,000 Chaos troops massing in the plains outside the Civitas Beati, and perhaps as much as 100,000 pieces of armor of various weight classes. After having continued to land troops for the rest of the day, there might very well be 1 million or more enemies ready to invade the city the next day. Presumably, the only reason they hadn't done so was, well, two things. Firstly, the same reason why they didn't level the city from orbit. They were hoping to give their assassins a good opportunity to break the Imperials' morale by killing off the Saint, and securing themselves a well-preserved corpse by doing so, instead of burying her beneath an artillery barrage. And two, because they wanted to make absolutely certain. They wanted to surround the entire Civitas Beati and leave no escape for the Saint. And they very nearly got their wish as well, as later on in the day, the blood-packed sniper, Saul, was the first one of the assassins to get a shot at the Saint. She was leading a mass sermon alongside many of the Imperial Guard servicemen, the PDF, and the militia forces. She was completely exposed, and Saul even had her dead to rights, were it not for the fact that the young Tanith Piper boy, Bryn Milo, who had always had a bit of a charmed life to him, one of the many stakers the Tanith regiment seemed to harbour on a near habitual basis, who always managed to get just in the way of Saul's shot, and not wanting to risk a lethal kill shot with an intervening object, Saul held his fire every time, till the point where he missed his window of opportunity. He was spotted by one of the Tanith snipers, Helene Larkin, who had just got a feeling that there was somebody out there and was raising his last rifle to take aim when Saul got a tingle down his back. Sinking back into cover just in time to save himself, Saul began to reposition, but Helene had already sent out the warning to the other Tanith snipers in the area. The Saint was not quite as unprotected as she at first seemed, and the next time Saul popped up to take a shot, another Tanith sniper, Nessa Burra, was waiting for him, and blew his head off with a precise long-last shot. And so the second of the 9 died. Even though the Imperials, of course, still did not know there were 9 of them, although this would soon be revealed to Ibram Gaunt, as he experienced another strange psychic happenstance. He entered a door on Heredor and met again the nun that he had encountered in the forest on Ex-Cardinal, the nun that had been a sister of battle that had served under the Beati during the initial conquest of the Sabbat worlds. You know, I'm starting to think that Ibram Gaunt might simply just be an absolute unrepentant lunatic. I mean, come on. All I'm in essence saying here is that for a non-insane person, he certainly does seem to see an awful lot of crazy stuff. Anywho, the nun informed him that there would be 9 assassins coming for the Beati, and that Ibram had to stand between them and her. She also gave him instructions on how to do so, cryptic and largely useless, but one interesting piece there within was related to Organ Sorik. Now, Gaunt was going to have more pressing things to deal with immediately, as come the next day the Chaos Forces threw their full weight into the attack, causing countless breaches in the Imperial second line of defenses. And worse still, their command structure was beginning to collapse. Yet more officers were dying left, right, and center. Holes in the Imperial defensive line opened for seemingly no reason, as if somebody had simply walked through. And then there was the death of Lanfred, the commander of Lugo's Life Company. He had simply just gone offline, stopped responding to communications, as he and his command headquarters had seemingly just disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving yet another gaping hole in the Imperial defenses, and taking away the defenders' main source of elite fighters and armor as well. Even the Tanith were barely doing any better, and a full-scale withdrawal, rout more like really, to the city's central keep was ordered. This would mean the abandonment, in essence, of the entirety of the Civitas Beati, all of its civilian populace, and anyone who was too slow to get into the keep in time. And problematically enough, one of the forces refusing to retreat was the Saint herself, who was fighting on the front line. Gaunt, Lugo, Biagi, everyone had sent her orders to begin her withdrawal to the keep as quickly as possible, with yet further impetus being lent this order by the fact that they now knew that they were assassins looking for her in particular. I kind of feel like the Imperials should have been guessing that from the beginning, as there was literally no other reason why the Chaos Forces would even be on Heredor, but hey, granted, they did have other things to concern their minds with at the time. Joining the rest of the withdrawing forces, Gaunt made his back towards the rear as well, where he summoned up Organ Sorik, who had already confessed to his secret. He was a psyker, and a very specific one as well. Ibram Gaunt managed to keep him from being executed immediately, but he was going to be held very carefully, as nobody was really in the mood to be trusting psychers at the moment. But after the intervention of the mysterious nun, having told Ibram Gaunt to rely on Sorik, he asked him what questions he thought were useful, and Organ provided some actual information, specifically the nature of the assassins. 3 reptiles, 3 psychers, a death machine, a marksman, and a phantom. Vague though that may be, that was by far the most firm intelligence that Gaunt had received on the matter so far. Now, the marksman was already dead. A sniper had been reported killed near the Beati, so that was 1 down. Hark had also mumbled something about being attacked by Loxitals, and having presumably managed to kill one of them, so that is 2 assassins down. As for a phantom, well, this jived with previous reports of a Dark Eldar ship, an assassin, a mandrake of some sort. Now, the Psychers and the Death Machine were still unclear, but at the very least now the defenders had something to act upon, and yet further insistent urgings were sent to the Beati to get her to start withdrawing. Luckily for the Imperials, another 3 would soon join the Marksman and the Reptile, as one of the assassins was Father Sin, the man who had almost killed Corm Corbeck on the Saints' world of Hagia. He had apparently gotten a hold of a couple of runt baby psychers, incredibly potent things that he was somehow able to control. He ran into Corm Corbeck again here on Heredor, and this time it was Corbeck who drew the longest straw, shoving a pipe bomb into Father Sin's mouth and tearing off the detonation tape. Yeah, good luck coming back from that one. Although it would later turn out that he had already succeeded in his part of the mission. The Loxodon mercenaries would also soon be killed, by Rorn and Nessie Banda, and Gol Collier finishing off the last two of them in the running skirmishes that were now happening throughout the city, as the Imperials were attempting to rush back to the keep and the last remaining defendable areas of the Civitas Beati. The Mandrake, the Dark Eldar assassin, was killed by the Tanith chief of scouts, McCall, a famously taciturn man who would later admit that the Mandrake had been pretty good before he'd put a lasbolt between his eyes. The final of the assassins, the Death Machine, revealed itself within the heart of the sacred balneary, where the Saint had brought together the commanders of the Imperial defense, along with several others to be honored in one final sermon, which she personally would lead. It would no doubt have been lovely, were it not for the Chaos Dreadnought that broke up through the bottom of the Sacred Fountain and tried to murder everyone, succeeding in murdering quite a few of the commanders of the Civitas defenses and the Imperial commanders as well. The Dreadnought was only stopped because of Gaunt's intervention, as he was wielding the only weapon around that could actually carve an opening in the Dreadnought's sarcophagus, the power sword of Hieronymus Sondar, which Gaunt had of course been granted after the defense of Vervanhive. The blue-wreathed sword managed to tear open a deep gash in the Dreadnought's hull. Not enough to kill it, not enough even to seriously wound it, but when a grenade detonated at the Dreadnought's feet and managed to topple it over, less so because of the blast and more so because of the damage it did to the floor, the Dreadnought was now submerged in the holy waters of the sacred balneary. This too alone would unlikely have done much, but there were flamethrower troopers in the room. After having initially been denied access to their flamethrowers, the Tanith and the other Imperial Guard forces had been given permission to wield flamers after it became apparent that the traditions of the Civitas Beati hardly mattered if the entire thing fell to chaos, and they had contributed crucially to the defense. Thus, they were being honored with this private ceremony. Gaunt ordered the flamethrowers to begin firing into the pool, boiling the water. The boiling water then flooded in through the rent in the Dreadnought's sarcophagus, boiling the long-dead Chaos Space Marine inside, to a final death this time. A final death that everyone seemingly was about to share. The city was falling. The main civilian spires fell to Innokenti later that day and in the early morning. The Magister had himself come down from orbit to start sacrificing civilians in the name of his patron deity. But what he had not gained control of just yet was the broadcasting system of the Civitas Beati. They had been running simple messages to shelter in place, and for the civilian populace to try and get away if they could. But now, the Saint recorded a brief message urging all faithful Imperial citizens to rise up and attack the invaders, stating that there was room enough for everyone in the Emperor's armies. Hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of civilians now began to rise up all across the city. Most of them had virtually no weaponry. Perhaps they had some scavenged PDF weapons, some dropped by the Blood Pact, maybe. Others wielded simple steel pipes, sticks, knives, whatever they could come across. They fell upon the invaders, and even if 10, 20, 30 of them died for every Blood Pact trooper they dragged down, the sheer numbers were beginning to tell. It would not in and of itself be anywhere near enough to swing the course of the battle, but it did drive Magister Innokenti mad with rage. He wanted the Saint, and he wanted her now, enough so to throw caution to the wind and lead a personal massed assault against the heart of the remaining Imperial defenders. On a massive concord, he and his main force was met by the Saints' countercharge. The light Chaos armor that had been rushed out ahead of the Magister were blasted apart by lifeguard tanks, slowly trundling back in reverse, taking enormous casualties as Lehman Russ after Russ was blasted apart by overwhelming, withering Stork tank fire. But they destroyed all of the enemy's lightly armored vehicles, forcing an infantry wave to crest up onto the promenade, led by Magister Innokenti. The moment it began to get into the open area, it was met by a massed counterattack of every reserve the Imperials could free up. The Tanith, Civitas, Defenders, PDF, Militia, anything and everything was hurled at Innokenti, throwing back his defenders long enough for the Saint leading the charge to reach the Magister personally. It was a close-run thing, Ibram Gaunt almost losing his life to the Magister's own life warden, Bryn Milo barely saving him, and the Saint taking several deep, horrifying wounds from Magister Innokenti's blade, effortlessly tearing her golden power armor to shreds. But it was the Saint who emerged victorious from their conflict, her gold-gleaming power sword decapitating the Chaos Magister, and then spilling his guts across the steps for all to see, killing him once and for all. This was, I believe now, the third or fourth time the Tanith won a victory based on slaying the enemy general. This, of course, is the problem with cults of personality and basing one's entire command and control structure of individuals. When they die, a lot of problems ensue. Granted, the Imperials were beginning to make the same mistake, and they were very nearly undone by the same mistake as well. During the efforts to shut off the broadcast that was sending out the Saint's message, the Blood Pact had detonated vast quantities of explosives near the Civitas Beati's main power generation structures. This had indeed cut off the broadcast, but it had also severed power to practically the entirety of the Civitas. This unlocked Orgon Sorik's cell, which he had been thrown in to be kept safe until further interrogation could be arranged for him. Rushing out, he found members of the Tanith first and only, McCall and Colm Corbeck, informing them desperately that all of the assassins had not yet been slain. The Psykers were not there to kill the Saint, they were there to find somebody else to kill the Saint. A deep infiltrator, a plant, somebody within the Defenders who could move unseen and unspotted until it was time to strike. And Orgon Sorik had his name. Immediately, Colm Corbeck brought everyone he could get rushing to the Saint's side, finding her heavily wounded and surrounded by Ibram Gaunt and other ghosts, who were just barely in time to save her from Lijah Chu, who had been the perfect subject for Father Sin's mental manipulations. Lijah managed to slay Colonel Colm Corbeck in the ensuing confusion, almost managed to kill Ibram Gaunt, and would very well have gone on to kill the Saint herself, near mortally wounded by Magister Innokenti, if it were not for the intervention of a Mad Hlain Larkin, who had, ever since ex-Cardinal, known that it was Lijah Chu who had killed his best friend Bragg on Fantine many months previously. Ever since, the sniper had kept a keen eye on Lijah Chu, a fortuitous one as it turned out, as with this, the final danger to the Saint was in essence over. The war would continue on for weeks thereafter, the Blood Pact initially driven out of the city due to the twin mass psychic strikes, first of the death of their master Innokenti, and secondly from being assaulted from all quarters by screaming hordes of hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Blood Pact, however, rallied and began striking into the Civitas Beati again, nearly overrunning it for a second time, were it not for counterattacks led by the wounded but still walking Saint Sabbat, leading the hordes of pilgrims in overwhelming human wave tactics against the Chaos forces. Ironically, the roles had completely flipped. Normally, of course, it was Chaos that would lead hordes of fanatical, brainwashed civilians to throw themselves against the guns of the disciplined ranks of the Imperial Guard. Now, it was the Imperium, led by one of their saints, glowing brightly if somewhat diminished, leading hordes of screaming civilians to bravely throw themselves upon the guns of the Blood Pact. Our brave warriors, their savage barbarian fighters. And even then it was a close-run thing. Had the battle been down to just the Chaos forces and the Imperials, the Blood Pact's commanders, eventually managing to regain command and control over their headless host, would probably still have been able to prevail. But the Imperial reinforcements finally arrived. In the face of 5 capital ships and a carrier, the remaining Chaos warships either fled or were destroyed. And on the ground, the now beaten, battered, bruised, exhausted, undersupplied and unsupported Blood Pact found themselves not only fighting the remnants of the Tanith, the Lifeguard, the PDF, and the militia, not to mention hundreds of thousands of civilians, but also 3 fresh, reinforced heavy infantry regiments and a company of armor as well, carrying out the exact same trick upon them as the Chaos forces had upon the Imperial defenders previously. Now it was the Imperials who had complete air superiority, who could deploy strike craft from their own carrier in orbit, who could rely on armored and infantry superiority and complete orbital command. And the Imperials, well, unlike the Chaos forces, they weren't looking to take any prisoners, and so I imagine the occasional orbital bombardment would have had a role to play as well. It still took weeks and months to hunt down every last remaining sliver of Chaos resistance, but the Tanith would not be there to see it. Having safeguarded the life of the Saint, their role in this drama was finally at long last over, and it had cost them dearly. The regiment had been massively reduced. A full platoon had actually been cut off outside of the final stronghold in the Civitas Beati, a mere half a kilometer from reaching the closing gates that Ibram Gaunt himself had ordered closed, fearing the Blood Pact might be storming in any moment. The regiment had also lost its second in command, the much beloved Colm Corbeck, who would, at least as one final little mercy, be buried in a gnarlwood coffin, as one of the last final remaining storage areas of gnarlwood, the prime premier export of Tanith in ages long past, was located right here on Heredor. Colm Corbeck might never see Tanith again, and he might never see the world that Gaunt was perhaps one day going to claim for the Tanith, but at least his final resting place would remind him forevermore of home, buried as a hero and as a soldier of the God Emperor who had saved one of his most luminescent servants. No Imperial citizen could ever ask for any greater honor than that, and the love of his comrades in arms, as Colonel Colm Corbeck would be sorely missed by the Tanith first and only forevermore. And with that, once more I bid you all adieu as we wrap up the battle for Heredor, a planet that had played a role of far vaster strategic significance than anyone could ever have imagined to contribute to such a backwater planet. It had seen the death of a Chaos Magister, and it had blunted an enormous Chaos force, preventing it from driving deeper into War Master Makaroth's exposed flank. All, of course, as the Saint herself had intended. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.